Welcome to the Scottish Rite Journal Podcast, an audio presentation of the Scottish Rite Journal, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. This week's article is A Masonic Apron at the Titanic Museum, Branson, Missouri, by M. Christopher Lee, 32nd degree, and comes from the September-October 2022 issue of the Scottish Rite Journal. If you are a Freemason who enjoys reading books or watching movies about the sinking of the unsinkable ship Titanic, then you probably will like the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri. Nestled in the heart of the famous resort town, the museum, its exterior shaped like the bow of the great ship, hosts a menagerie of RMS Titanic artifacts and exhibits. Among the displays is a full-scale reproduction of the Titanic's grand staircase, leading between the first and second levels, staterooms, the ship's bridge, and a water basin that is permanently kept at 27 degrees, the temperature of the water the night the ship sank, in which visitors can place their hands. On my recent visit, I was about a quarter of the way through my tour when an old Masonic apron caught my eye. The apron, along with its case inscribed with the owner's lodge number, Abbey Lodge number 3341, Hertfordshire, belonged to Brother Herbert J. Pitman, Titanic's third officer and the second highest ranking officer to survive the April 15, 1912 disaster. Second Officer William Murdoch ordered Pitman to take command of lifeboat number 5, which was the second lifeboat to launch that night, about an hour after the Titanic's infamous collision with an iceberg. Brother Pitman was not the only Freemason to set sail aboard the Titanic on her ill-fated maiden voyage. 16 former or active Masons were known to have been aboard, 11 English and 5 American. Because priority was given to women and children first, all but 2 perished. Interestingly, Brother Pitman was one of the witnesses who later testified that he thought the Titanic had gone down in one piece instead of breaking in 2. Herbert J. Pitman was a fellow craft at the time of the sinking. He was initiated at Abbey Lodge number 3341 in Hertfordshire, probably at the Red Lion Hotel, Hatfield, on June 14, 1909, and passed to the degree of fellowcraft on March 10, 1910. He was not raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason until June 12, 1912, 2 months after Titanic sank. He continued on at the White Star Line after the Titanic disaster, serving aboard, among others, the RMS Oceanic and Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. He retired to the village of Pitcombe, Somerset County, in 1946 after a career spanning more than 50 years at sea. He remained a member of Abbey Lodge number 3341 for the remainder of his life, although he never held office and is strangely not mentioned in either of the 2 lodge histories, 1959 and 2009. Abbey Lodge number 3341 was granted its warrant on November 12, 1908, and constituted on March 29, 1909. During World War II, the lodge moved to Barnet, and then to Salisbury Hotel, Hibernet, London, in 1947. Indeed, Abbey Lodge number 3341 had many homes over the years. Sadly, it went permanently dark in 2012 and surrendered its charter on February 15, 2013. Its minute books are unaccounted for, but fortunately Brother Pitman's Masonic apron and case, along with several other personal items, are in the collection of Cedar Bay Entertainment of Branson, Missouri. As such, they provide an interesting Masonic link to the timeless history of the RMS Titanic. As an added feature to this Scottish Rite Journal podcast, I had the privilege to speak with Brother Mike regarding his article. Hope you enjoy it. Recently, in the museum in Pigeon Forge, and I assume Branson, passengers of the Jewish faith and passengers of Irish heritage were highlighted with ribbons on their names and portraits. Has there ever been an effort to mark the Masonic pictures in the same way?
As far as I know, there has not been. There were a total of about 16 Freemasons aboard the Titanic, and out of that, 9 of them were crew members. And as far as I know, Martin Cherry from the Museum of Freemasonry sent me an article from the Freemason Chronicle that was only published about 2 weeks after the sinking, that did feature Herbert Pitman and several of the other names of the Masons who were aboard. But at least in Branson, and as you mentioned, Pigeon Forge, they have not separated out the Masons There were, many more Irish, a majority of the third class passengers, Irish and Italian, and a lot of Jewish passengers, Jewish members of the crew, members of the band. And in short, no, nobody has done that in any of the Titanic museums I'm aware of.
16 total active or former Masons were aboard the ship. Were there any meetings conducted? Is that sort of thing commonplace outside of lodge settings? And did any of those other active or former Masons know of the others in the first place on the ship?
I had actually thought of that when I was writing the article, and there's nothing has ever been documented about if there were Masonic meetings on the Titanic. There were 16, as I said, 16 Masons on board. One had dropped, and one fifth officer, Harold Lowe, who was a very colorful character. During the William Alden Smith Senate subcommittee hearings, he kept asking for permission to curse. And in the movie Titanic, he was the one who fired the warning shots over the water to try to keep passengers from jumping onto the lifeboat as they were lowering it. But Harold Lowe did become a Freemason, but 9 years after. So that's where we get the number 16. Out of the 16 that were on board, 9 were crew members. And I did a cross-reference just out of curiosity. And it seems that at least among the crew members, and it has to be kept in mind that Titanic was only a float for not a float, but only, on its maiden voyage for about a week. And many of these other people, including Herbert Pitman, were drawn from other boats around White Star. But I did a breakdown. And we have one musician, a guy that worked in the mailroom who happened to be an American. An Italian waiter at the a la carte restaurant. Now, he wasn't actually a member of the crew. The a la carte restaurant was independently owned. 2 first-class stewards, one storekeeper, first-class waiter, and the second engineer. And among the passengers, there were 5 in first class and 1 in second class. And out of the 5 in first class, 4 were Americans. None of them belonged to the same lodge, although 2 of them did belong to lodges in Manhattan. But there's really no documentation that they met or got together. If it was today, in the age of social media, may have been more likely Titanic Mason group. But 110 years ago, it would be much less likely they would know. I mentioned the second engineer. Pitman, who was a fellow craft at the time, wouldn't have. The engineers dined separately. Most of the crew, first-class stewards, second-class stewards, they had their own dining salons. So there's very little interaction among the variety of people I just mentioned.
A career spanning 50 plus years, along with a highly traumatic incident, had to span a variety of duties for Brother Pitman. What were his duties aboard the Titanic along with the other ships that he served on?
Well, Pitman joined the Merchant Navy when he was 18 years old. Started his apprenticeships. He moved on to White Star Lines about 1906. Aboard the Titanic, his primary duty was to pinpoint the ship's location using celestial navigation, which a sextant, and also to calculate the compass deviation, because the compass is always a little bit off depending on, and they were in northern waters then too, where it would affect the compasses more. He also stood bridge watches and ran lifeboat drills, and they did run those, and general deck duties. Now, later on in his career, according to everything I've read, Pitman's eyesight deteriorated, and he went from being a deck officer to a purser, which he served out the remainder of his career, dealing with passengers, dealing with paperwork. The Titanic had a purser's office on sea deck. And then he left White Star in the 1920s and continued on at, a variety of other companies. During World War II, he served on the SS Manitoba, which was a mail ship, which was towards the end of his career. He retired shortly after the war, just about the age of 70. But as for a traumatic event, Pitman isn't as known among the surviving Titanic officers because he was on the second boat that launched. an hour after the hit. And he didn't even think, according to his Senate subcommittee testimony, he didn't even think the ship was going to sink for another hour. But it is heart-wrenching to hear him to describe hearing the people screaming in the water after the boat had finally foundered.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And he made an effort and tried to talk the 3-man crew of the boat plus the passengers into going, and was stopped. And then he said they basically sat there and waited until the sound died down quite a bit. Then several passengers were offloaded to Harold Lowe's boat, and then they went back searching for survivors, which they didn't find. So his testimony, it seemed heart-wrenching hearing him describe it to Senator Smith. Another quick thing about that, in a day and age where it might take years for a Senate subcommittee hearing to happen, the Titanic's inquiry happened within 2 weeks of the sinking. The owner, Bruce Ishmay, who survived, four of the officers and many of the crew were actually held on subpoena. They were trying to get back to England. And William Alden Smith, the senator who led the investigation, conducted the entire thing, final report and everything, within about a month of the sinking. And it's curious that many of the static facts that we know about the Titanic sinking that happened were really discovered in that first month, about how close the Californian was, about the ice warnings, Captain Smith's actions.
That's impressive that far back it was completed that fast.
Well, like I say, he was keeping them under subpoena, and there were arguments in the press, both in the United States and in England, attacking Smith. And there were pro papers in England. It was like nothing new under the sun, really. It was a political fight, just carried out in the newspapers of the time.
Yeah, and you mentioned they waited for the screams to die down. That had to have been something that haunted him for the rest of his life.
You can read the anguish in his voice in the congressional testimony or the Senate committee testimony. And he didn't have as much to say. He had less questions, and because he was off the ship, rather quickly. Mm-hmm. He could testify about what happened after, but all the details, with Harold Lowe firing warning shots, First Officer Murdoch's apparent suicide, which is still to this day controversial if it happened, that he had shot himself on the bridge. He obviously didn't survive to tell the story, but there were witnesses that said that. And so, like I said, he had less to contribute about what happened after the collision.
You mentioned that Abbey Lodge, number 3341, went dark in 2012 and surrendered its charter in 2013. Why is this?
Martin Cherry at the Museum of Freemasonry in London, he got a lot of this information back to me rather rapidly, I think within a week, including researching Pitman's career, seeing if he had ever held office, which Pitman did not hold office ever. But he said that he told me that in May 16th of 2012, they attempted to have a meeting, and they didn't make the quorum, the 7 that they needed. And then about 6 months passed, and then on November 14th of 2012, they had one last meeting where they surrendered their charter. And then they were officially stricken the following year in February 15th, 2013. But it was what's been happening with a lot of lodges in both England and the United States, dwindling attendance. It's finally succumbed to it, which is sad because it was a lodge with a history. Pitman was one of the earlier members of it. It was out a little bit before he joined. But it's also a lodge that, along with some others, during World War II had provided regalia and furniture to, I think, in China somewhere. One of the lodges that got raided by Japanese soldiers. And Abbey Lodge contributed to refurbishing that lodge.
What were the other personal items of Brother Pitman that were found aboard the ship? Did they have any Masonic nature? And also, the Titanic set sail from the UK and unfortunately sank in the Northern Atlantic. How on earth did the museum end up in Branson, Missouri?
There are Titanic museums all over the country, all over the world. And many of the artifacts that are in these museums are what I call, I call them second-tier artifacts. First-tier artifacts are things that have been brought up from the bottom or were found floating on the surface by the many search and rescue ships in the days after. And the Branson Museum, and I think they switched this between them and Pigeon Forge, I think they have a life jacket that was found on the surface. Now, when I say second tier, these are items that were either carried off by members or off by survivors, like the famous first class menu that I don't know which museum has that, but that was carried off in a person's pocket. The Branson Museum has an order pad from one of the first class saloon waiters, and I think that may have come off when it stopped in Queenstown.
Okay.
A lot of people think Titanic even the Titanic movie skips over it. It goes from Southampton, Queenstown, then out into the Atlantic, Queenstown, Ireland. And then other things or items people had on them when they were on the Titanic and escaped. They have a purse from a third class passenger in Branson. She had it on her. That was on the Titanic with her. Now, all of Pitman's items were not recovered from the wreck of the Titanic. Pitman's cabin was on the boat deck to the rear of the bridge, port side near the number one smokestack, along with several other officer cabins. And those got pretty beat. I don't even know if they've ever been in those to explore. They got pretty beat up. Robert Ballard, who discovered the Titanic, described it as looking like a giant fist had squashed them. Among all the officers, E.J. Smith, the captain's cabin, is the one everybody wants to see the most. And it, part of it got ripped apart. The bridge is completely gone. It was ripped. I think as it hit the bottom, the plume of water it was dragging behind it, hit it, and squashed it. But E.J. Smith's bathtub is a super famous Titanic artifact. They never brought it up. It's still but it's one of the things they discovered, and other expeditions keep going back to it over time. And at one point, it disappeared because the roof caved in the cabin as the wreck deteriorates. So the items, Masonic items and other items that belong to Pitman were donated, and came into the possession of Cedar Bay Entertainment. It is his Masonic apron. And if anybody wants to look on their website, they have a press photo of the display with all these items. But it is his Masonic apron, which is a standard British style apron. The apron case, his petition to Abbey Lodge, which is good, a pine storage box, 2 signal flags, a deck of cards, and it looks like a copy of the British inquiry questions that were given to Second Officer Lightoller. And he was told not to share them, but he gave them to Pitman to help Pitman prepare for his testimony. There were 2 Titanic inquiries, the one done by William Alden Smith in the United States, and then there was the British inquiry, which happened a little bit later. So those were, so like I say, they've never been into Pitman's cabin on the Titanic. It is currently illegal to take anything out of the 2 pieces of the Titanic wreck. The Titanic broke in 2 and the pieces are sitting about a half a mile apart. Now, it is legal to take things from the debris field in between, and including what's called, in Las Vegas, there's a Titanic exhibit at the Luxor. They have what's called the Big Piece, which is a 17-ton section of hull plating from sea deck that they took. They actually were cranking it up, and it actually fell back down at one point. And it took them forever to get it. 17 tons. But they have that at the Luxor, and I would like to see that. I mean, you're looking at the actual side of the Titanic there. So, and then, like in the Branson Museum, some stuff is owned by them. Others artifacts are on loan from collections that probably lend them out to other museums. So it's like in a way a professional community of artifact sharing and cooperation that allows people all over the world to share in the Titanic experience. The other things at the museum, as mentioned in my article, are the reproduction of the first class staircase. It's amazing. The grand staircase was 6 decks. Plus, there was a rear grand staircase too. It was 5 decks. And then there was the second class grand staircase. But the main grand staircase, the part, even in the article, the graphic that was used, it always depicts the very top, the boat deck, just below the dome. And the clock that is there is called Honor and Glory. And unfortunately, most of the wood structures disintegrated here. They weren't able to retrieve that because they've used the domes of the grand staircases as entry points to explore the wreck.
Gotcha.
Because basically, there's two giant round holes right in the ceiling. Well, except for the rear section of the Titanic is totally wrecked. I know it's wrecked, but it is crushed, demolished. James Cameron, when he was making Titanic, attempted to get one of his little remotes, his drones, into the a la carte restaurant and couldn't even do it. It's in much, much worse shape. So most of the exploration happens at the front half. If you ever get a chance, there's a group called Titanic Honor and Glory. Since for the last 5 or 6 years, they've been doing a digital recreation of the Titanic using the Unreal game engine. And they're doing it it's for free download on their website. And you need a decent gaming computer to run it, or at least not the old. The first real demo they put out was 5% of the ship. And the recent demos are up to 25% of the ship. And when they say it's 25% of the ship, that's almost 100% of the public spaces that you can just walk around. And the detail is just so I've gotten a lot. I think that's what really brought me back into the Titanic fold, being able to see all 6 levels of the grand staircase. You get a better appreciation knowing it's going from deck to deck. Each landing has either a clock or a portrait. And one of the 5% releases is in virtual reality. That's why I own an Oculus Quest 2, just so I could look at the virtual reality Titanic, and that is stunning. To sit in the a la carte restaurant or the first class dining salon, it's full, pretty photorealistic, 3D, and it's breathtaking. And I hope they eventually do the rest. The next release is going to be 50% of the total space on the ship. But a lot of that's crew space that the regular passengers want to see. And they have all the old demos too. You don't have to get the most up to date ones. The less space, the easier it is for the computer to handle it.
Like and share this article, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you wish to comment, please leave one, and as a reminder, hit the notifications bell. Any accompanying photographs or citations for this article can be found in the corresponding print edition. The Scottish Rite Journal is published by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Mark Dreisenstock, 32nd Degree, KCCH, Managing Editor. I'm your host, Matt Bowers.